Okay, well, welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon, the role of forests in maintaining a resilient landscape. This is a part of a series that VNRC and VCB has been doing around climate resilience and climate action and the ways that the different program areas of our organizations intersect with creating a resilient landscape here in Vermont, as well as reducing our climate emissions. Today, we're joined by Jamey, Fidel, and Hilke as they talk about the role of forests play in climate resilience. There's going to be time for Q&A at the end after we talk a little bit about the ways that we can conserve our forest land and the different policies that are up for consideration in the legislature this session, and the ways that even landowners can be a part of the solution for forest preservation. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand it over to Jens.
Thank you so much, Sheldon, and thanks everyone for joining us. I know some of the folks on the webinar today, and welcome again. All right. Are you all seeing my screen, Sheldon?
Yes, we are.
Great. Okay, so to kick things off, I just wanted to zoom out to the big picture. And in my work with communities across Vermont with the Fish and Wildlife Department, the distinction between where there's forest and where there isn't forest is a really important one as we think about climate resilience and our climate future. I think about this in the concept of a forest or a habitat block. And so I'm not talking about the ownership of the forest, the parcels. I'm just talking about land cover. And strictly speaking, there are a variety of habitat types in there and not just forested habitat types. So I'm talking about all the trees of a forest, but also forested wetlands and other habitat types that are related to forests. And so these, we map them as areas of natural cover surrounded by roads, development, and agriculture. And what you see on screen is colored by size. So the larger forested blocks in Vermont tend to fall along the spine of the Green Mountains and up into the Northeast Kingdom. And then there are a few spotted around. But really in the Champlain Valley and in the Connecticut River Valley, they're much smaller forest blocks, but they also have a lot of biological diversity. So when you're working with data like these, you can zoom in and look at that pattern of where there are large forest blocks or smaller forest blocks across an area. Here, I'm zoomed in on the Mad River Valley, and you can see that Facein has a massive forest block, part of that Mount Mansfield block up in the top right corner of your screen. And then as you get closer to the Mad River, the blocks get a little bit smaller. So I want to introduce this idea of forest pattern and how we map them. Now, there's a spectrum of benefits from the street trees that I have out in front of my house here in Burlington to large forest blocks. And certainly I get value from those street trees here in Burlington. But as a society, we get exponentially more benefits from larger blocks of forest than individual trees or smaller blocks of forest. And so these large blocks of forest are critically important for climate resilience. First of all, it's habitat for thousands of plant and animal species. We have an estimated 24 to 43,000 species in Vermont, and forested ecosystems are home to the majority of those. Forest functions include improving air, water, and soil quality, and they provide opportunities for recreation as well as for employment and economic stimulation from the forest products industry. Larger forest blocks are going to reduce the harmful effects of natural disasters on the rest of the landscape. And with climate change, those are happening more frequently and with greater intensity. And then forests have this huge potential to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And a forest can be a carbon sink, i.e. grabbing that carbon. If it absorbs more CO2 from the atmosphere, then it releases. And that carbon is going to be held in tree branches and leaves and so forth. And we can even think about that as an economic benefit, as trees store those tons of carbon and the economic return from that service. So I want to put out there that there's this spectrum of benefits, and we as a society get more benefits from larger forest blocks. And so as we think about our climate future and building resilience, maintaining forest is a huge part of that. Now, it's not just ecological values that I want to talk about. The forests power the Vermont's economy. And so that's a part of sustainability as we think into the future. The forest recreation and tourism provide about 1.9 billion to Vermont annually. Forest products are going to add another 1.5 billion to that. That's 12% of Vermont's GDP. Fall foliage tourism is 25% of the tourist income to Vermont. Hunting, fishing, and wildlife watching generate 685 million to Vermont's economy alone. And then we can think about intact wetlands and riparian areas and the reduction in damage from floods in the millions of dollars in terms of economic return. So I think about forests and managing them for this idea of an ecologically functional landscape. And I'm going to talk more about that moving forward. But this is a balancing act because the forest health plays a role in our economy and our community. And so we need to balance these different values, but we need to understand that forest health really is going to underpin that economic return and the health of our communities. I also want to think about forests using 3 words. We want to maintain them as intact, connected, and diverse. Okay, I'm going to pick up on this: intact, connected, and diverse. So we want our forests to be in the largest blocks, the largest intact blocks we can. And then we want those forest blocks to be connected to one another. And then we want them to be diverse, full of different natural communities, different structure types, old forest, young forest, all of these different values. Okay. So as we think about diverse, well, larger blocks of forest are going to have more species diversity than smaller blocks. And so at left, you can see this is research done in Maine, and it certainly applies here. At left, you can see a huge forest block and that long list of species that can be sustained there. And at right would be a completely isolated small block, 1 to 20 acres. And you can see that it's really suburban species that you can expect to find in a place like that. So we can say as a general rule, larger blocks, more species diversity, smaller blocks, less diversity. Now, that is if all things are created equal, if those small blocks are actually completely isolated and not connected. They're not behaving as if they're larger. I'll pick up on that in a second. But that kind of gets us to this idea of forest pattern. And so to illustrate this, here's the Waterbury-Stowe town line. At left, you can see Route 100 going up towards Moscow Road. And this is 1962 aerial photo. And I've colored what I consider to be forest here in 1962. And so you can see 1962, 1974, 1980, 1996, 2007, and 2011. So in the 50 years of this transition, a lot has changed. And you might be interested to know that the total area of green on the slide, what I consider forest, hasn't changed in that 50-year period. Some of the old fields you might not have noticed did grow up into young forests, and some of the parts of the forest block have been isolated and they're now not part of the forest. They're trees. They're surrounded by roads and development. They're a small little clump of woods. And so what's really changed most dramatically in that 50-year period is the forest pattern. and the extent to which this block is no longer connected north to south. And I'm going to show you in a second, it remains to be seen whether it's connected east to west. This is actually the Hawkins-Hilke Wildlife Corridor, and I'll show you the same area in another slide. So here's that same area with Route 100 bisecting the forest. And we can think about the forests here off to the left, that Mansfield Range. You know, remember I said intact, connected, and diverse? Well, the Mansfield block is really intact, and it's home to a variety of species with big home ranges. A black bear might have a home range of 30 square miles, or bobcat have 27 square mile home ranges. They move around a lot to get what they need over the course of the year. So this Mansfield block is 72,000 acres in and of itself. So that's hugely important for biological diversity and the intactness piece that I mentioned earlier. Now the Madonna block is quite close, and Route 108 is closed in the winter, and that's another 32,000 acres. So in effect, this is behaving like a 104,000 acre block because of the connectedness of these two different intact blocks. Now this is the Putnam State Forest, or the Worcester Range block. And the area I am showing you with that red arrow is what I showed you earlier, that crossing across Route 100, the Schuettsville Hill. And so it remains to be seen if those are still connected. If they are functionally connected, that would add another 54,000 acres to this network. And so we can see how individual blocks can build into something bigger when they're connected. Now, connection are going to mean different things to different species at different scales. So here are some points, radio telemetry data of a bobcat and this is the northern part of Shelburne Pond. And so you can see that bobcat spent a bunch of time in the forest, not in the open ag land. You can see he spent a good bit of time in the wetland habitats themselves. And then look at this. So from the perspective of this bobcat, in the short hop between the wetland of Shelburne Pond and that forest block to the east, this tree line was sufficient to connect those blocks. Now that only works because it's a short hop, and that's really particular to bobcat, that they're willing to venture along a tree line like that. But the concept is important, that we're connecting blocks and that there are these features that connect the blocks. Now, we can think about this again on this statewide scale of regional connectivity and how all of our forests along the spine of the Greens and even into the Piedmont up into the Northeast Kingdom are connected. This highway for wildlife movement. We can even zoom out more and think about this network of connected forests across the entire northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion. And what I'm showing on screen are connecting lands in between the large forest blocks. That's what those colors represent, the linkages, the connecting lands between large forest blocks. And so we can think about this system of connected forests across the whole state or across the whole region. And whatever scale you want to think about it, Vermont is really this crossroads because of this connected forest pattern. And so that's incredibly important for resilience into the future for the whole region. Now, all of these scales matter as we think about connected forests and the benefits they're going to give. That individual wildlife road crossing, that statewide scale, as well as that eco-regional scale. So that's the intact and connected piece that I've been talking about. So you can really see how these values come together on the BioFinder website. And BioFinder hosts Vermont Conservation Design. And that's the Agency of Natural Resources and their partners work to create this vision for what the ecologically functional landscape looks like. And as I said earlier, this idea is based on this idea of ecological function, the ability of plants and animals to interact as needed in order to thrive, reproduce, migrate, and move even as the climate changes. So really baked into the design, this conservation design, is this idea of maintaining intact forests and allowing plants and animals to move even as the climate changes. And so forests are a critically important component of that. Now we're using forests and this forest block as a concept, as a coarse filter type concept. Now I told you in terms of diversity, the vast majority of Vermont species live in forests. And so if we can conserve at the scale of forest, there are a lot of species that come with you as part of that package. They may have small home ranges or whatever that are going to come with you when you conserve that forest. And I mean that word conserve in all the senses of the word. So we're thinking about conservation at the scale of forest blocks as a coarse filter for this whole suite of species that rely on these forested ecosystems. Now, there's another aspect of forests as we think about resilience that's baked into Vermont conservation design. And that is the physical landscape. And so here I'm really talking about physical characteristics like the landforms, you know, where there are hills, where there are valleys, the bedrock, you know, where is there bedrock that has calcium in it? Where is there bedrock that doesn't? Or elevation and microclimates, aspect and exposure. So these are characteristics in the physical landscape, okay? Now, there's a great link between the diversity in the physical landscape and diversity in the biological landscape. There's actually a greater correlation between biological diversity and geology than most anything else. So we can use diversity in the physical landscape as a surrogate for where there's going to be biological diversity into the future. Now, I know I just threw a lot at you, but I'm trying to express this way that the physical landscape can be mapped, and it is the home, the stage for the biological actors, even as those actors move on and off the stage with climate change. And physical landscape diversity is mapped in Vermont conservation design. And it's one of the attributes of forests that are taken into account and really baked into that design. And so as we think about forests and where there's forests, it's not just because of carbon storage. It's also this idea of resilience because of physical landscape diversity. Okay, so let me just give you an example. As we think about Waitsfield, there in the Mad River Valley, you know, this is what BioFinder and Vermont conservation design looks like. And it is it shows priority, highest priority and priority areas across the town and at the statewide scale. And so forests are a critically important part of this, but they're not all of it, right? You can see on this slide they're riparian areas. And it's hard to tell, but that same network of forest is also connecting to places of diversity in the physical landscape. So it's not an a la carte menu where you can say, well, let's just conserve the forest. All of these different parts of the landscape come together and interact. And that's what we're mapping in Vermont conservation design. Now, this is that pattern we're looking for, where we've got these large forest blocks like the dark colored blobs on screen, and then stepping stone forests like the one in the middle that play such an important role in connecting features. And then you can see there are wildlife road crossings that are highlighted, and those you can think of as micro connectors. And then at right, there's the surface water and riparian areas network. Again, another type of connect. So my point here is forests are critically important for climate resilience. We can think about them at a variety of different scales, but we also need to zoom down and think about how forests are connected. And these surface waters and riparian areas are a huge part of that, those connections between forests. And here's the map. I'm sorry that I used two colors of green, but you can see the lighter color of green in the middle, the Mad River Valley, and the extent to which it brings together the forests from the east and the west in Waitsfield. And then these wildlife road crossings. And again, I'll show you the Waitsfield map. Oh, sorry, my animation didn't work. But we can think about these wildlife road crossings and how, again, they're micro connectors between forests. But that's what I've got for my segment, is that idea of forest resilience and this thinking about forests as intact, connected, and diverse. With that, Jamey, I'm going to hand it over to you to take on the next stage. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Jens. That was really awesome overview. And are folks able to see the presentation now?
You're good.
Okay, great. So as Jens was just describing, a lot of our work at VNRC in partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Department and Agency of Natural Resources in many parts of the state is trying to maintain forests as forests and trying to maintain an intact and connected and resilient landscape. Part of our work also includes tracking what are the challenges or the primary threats to maintaining a resilient landscape. So I'm going to walk through very quickly a couple of metrics that we're tracking, such as the outright conversion of forests, so forest loss. So the Forest Service has been tracking this. And what we're experiencing now is a decline in the extent of forest that we have in Vermont. Huge success story from heavy land clearing 100 years ago. Plus, when we had a lot of sheep farms and heavy logging in the state, to reforestation. But now every year we are losing forests due to forest land conversion and development. According to the Forest Service, it's approximately 14,000 acres a year. There's some forests that revert back to forest from agricultural lands that comes into the overall net amount of forest that we're losing. But I think there's consensus now among natural resource professionals and agencies that we are losing our forests on an annual basis, and that is of concern. And then we have the breaking up of forest. Jens showed you some slides of the forest fragmentation that occurs. And really the precursor to the fragmentation is something called parcelization, or the subdivision of our land. It's just simply taking parcels and creating more and more parcels as we continue to grow and develop in the state. And then there's the infrastructure, the roads, the utilities, the homes that come with that. And that has a fragmenting impact on our landscape and affects us both ecologically and economically, as these forests may be less viable for the benefits that Jens highlighted before, and also for the economic importance for different for forest products, recreation, tourism, and all that. So this is all to say that we know we're going to continue to develop in Vermont. What's the pattern going to look like, and can we maintain a resilient landscape as we do develop? Just wanted to let you all know that we've been doing a lot of research on these subdivision or parcelization trends. We have multiple reports that are available on our website. In 2018, we did the most comprehensive sort of overview, and we're actually updating now the data to go through 2020, and that will be published soon. We don't have a whole lot of time to run through all of these results. We actually have separate webinars on some of this research. But just to give you a lay of the land, that back in 2016, and again, we're going to update this soon to the year 2020, still a large percentage of Vermont was represented in what we'd consider to be larger parcels, let's say 50 acres or larger. But 40% of those parcels are classified as residential, meaning there's a home on that parcel and infrastructure. Woodland, which is undeveloped forest land, represents about 25–26%. So while we still have a lot of parcels in Vermont, a lot of them have residences and infrastructure impacts. And then if you look at sort of like what we're losing and what we're gaining, this is just a way of showing you that we're gaining the land that's classified as residential, and the category that's decreasing at the fastest rate right now is undeveloped woodland in the state, more so than agricultural land. And so this is of concern to us. We also in Vermont for a long time, I think, had a narrative that we're not growing as a state population wise. That doesn't mean that we don't have subdivision occurring. We have a very robust, second home and second people who spend time and enjoy Vermont with a second home. And so subdivision has been occurring, and we've quantified that, over this study period that we looked at, that we had, an increase in almost 21,000 parcels that had a new home on it, an 8.8% increase. And this was right before we essentially, well, this is just to show you that we have this parcelization website. You can look at all the data, and it's based on, you can look at it regionally, at the townwide level, at the statewide level, and we'll be updating this soon. But what I wanted to get at is those statistics I was showing you was before we just recently had this phenomenon, which I think should not be a surprise to many of you, that over the last couple of years, as we had COVID and we're considering climate migration, both starting to occur in Vermont at a recognizable rate. And so here you can see the property transfer data showing that we had a very big uptick here in out-of-state buyers compared to the norm. And that may continue as we deal with climate migration. And I think we all know Vermont's a very desirable place to live. And it's going to continue to be desirable for people to move here as there's more stressors and more natural disturbance and climactic events that are really causing great impact to people who are living in communities that are either on fire or flooding and some of the other natural disasters that we're seeing. This is just a way of looking at the property sales and an incredible increase in value of land, which puts pressure on landowners to be able to hold on to land without resorting to development. Land values are going up significantly, especially in southern Vermont. We're seeing a lot of residential property being sold and transferred, and increases in the value of land, especially around resort areas. And this is all part of the factors, the mix that we're looking at as far as what is the ability for us to hold on to undeveloped forest land in Vermont without resorting to outright conversion and development. So just some very quick slides here about some of the impacts we're already seeing from a climate change perspective in Vermont. We are seeing warmer temperatures already, and impacts to our seasons, and more precipitation. And these impacts are going to continue to grow in severity. There was recently a Vermont climate assessment that was conducted by the University of Vermont and other partners. And it's a good summary of what we can expect here in Vermont. We don't have time to go through it. I'm just going to flag some of these resources and reports that are available to you. But as climate change worsens, expected to see bird species decline, including the loss of some of our most iconic species, including the hermit thrush, common loon, and other important species. We're going to see exacerbated threats from invasive species and plants, change in our forest composition, disease, and these will all be compounded by climate-related factors such as worsening storms and irregularities in precipitation. We're going to see a more severe impacts to urban trees because of the effects of the built environment and increases of temperature and different functions, water cycling, and our ecosystem functions that are going to be disrupted. And so I think many of you already know that we're looking at some pretty significant impacts based on climate. There was recently a Global Warming Solutions Act in Vermont that was passed, and it kicked off a whole process to develop a climate action plan based on a lot of different subcommittees coming together and doing a lot of policy research and developing strategies. Part of the overall work was to come up with strategies to encourage climate adaptation and resilience of Vermont communities and natural systems. There's also greenhouse gas reduction targets, but since we're talking more about resilient landscapes in this webinar, and we have other webinars that are focused more on those topics, I just wanted to let you know that there's this framework, there is this plan, and there are a lot of strategies and policies identified. We don't have enough time to go through all of the strategies and measurable activities that are recommended across these 5 impact areas. Just flagging that one of the buckets is resilient working in natural lands. And there's a whole host of strategies in there, some of which are in play in the legislature now. And I want to quickly be able to get to that. But just to give you a very quick flavor, the strategies are very diverse related to forests. It's for everything from technical assistance to help municipalities maintain intact forests, to improving our land use regulations at the statewide level to address forest fragmentation, to accelerate land conservation, to increase, support and funding for nature-based solutions, urban tree planting, and the list goes on and on. In concert with the Fish and Wildlife Department, one of the big efforts that we've been focused on to maintain a resilient landscape is improvements to our land use planning to maintain forests, intact forests and forest blocks, and connectivity between those blocks. So Act 171 was passed in 2016. It requires towns and regional planning commissions to identify areas that are important and should be considered as forest blocks and habitat connectors and maintained in a way to try and reduce the fragmentation of those areas as we continue to build out in the state. There was A&R guidance document that was put together to try and help municipalities actually work through the planning process. A lot of it is based on the science that Jens was sharing through BioFinder and conservation design. And we recently, in concert with the Fish and Wildlife Department, did a comprehensive review of all the town plans and zoning bylaws and subdivision regulations in the state. This is something we do every 10 years to see what's the progress that we're making in maintaining natural resource functions, wildlife functions, forest functions in our communities, and how are we doing, and this informs the technical assistance work that Jens and VNRC and regional planning commissions do and professional planners on these topics. We have webinar on the results of this comprehensive recent effort. We're about to publish a final report you can read. I'm just going to share a couple of the highlights with you. We measured progress in addressing climate change, and what we noticed is that about a quarter of the town plans are actually acknowledging issues around climate change. So we've got a lot of work to do here. It's a complicated topic. How municipalities should address these issues at the town planning level is again, can be very complicated. And but we're measuring, how communities are doing, and this shows that some are tackling this head on and acknowledging it, and there's a lot of room for improvement to help communities as they grapple with this. A real success story that we're seeing, though, is measuring the progress of Act 171 implementation for forest blocks and connectivity. And we saw, based in a 10-year study period, that we've made huge inroads in both acknowledging at the town plan level the issues of fragmentation and identifying, the role of travel corridors, connectivity, and maintaining large forest blocks. So we saw a doubling on this front, and that's very encouraging. And I think that's attributable to the great work that Jens does at Fish and Wildlife Department and work we've been doing at VNRC to try and offer both an understanding around these issues and strategies to address this. Now that's at the town plan side. Now we're understanding what's going on in the regulatory side. Are towns then actually doing any review to understand how we can minimize the fragmentation of our landscape? We looked across a number of different zoning districts and how these zoning districts are represented, how popular they are, and whether they review for wildlife impacts or have fragmentation standards to try and minimize the effects of habitat and forest fragmentation. Well, we saw that if a town has one of these very specific sort of natural resource or wildlife districts or an overlay district, that while a few towns actually implement them, they have a very high degree of sort of consideration of these wildlife and fragmentation considerations. But it's these districts where our overall development is really happening. This is where our residential development is occurring. And you see that's a very small percentage of these districts that have any standards to review or minimize fragmentation. So we're very much focused now on how do we improve, having actual standards to review fragmentation at both the local level and at the statewide level through our land use laws like Act 250. So that's a good segue then into, I'm just going to hit very quickly on 3 bills that are moving through the legislature now that are priorities for VNRC and many other partners. And obviously there's more legislation in play, but these specifically relate to some forest policies and work to implement recommendations that came out of the Climate Action Plan. There's been for many years now, I think I've been working for at least a decade in Vermont, along with VNRC colleagues, on comprehensive reform of Act 250. So how do we strengthen? Where are the gaps in resource protections? And also, how do we acknowledge that we do have a housing crisis? And how can we find efficiencies in creating the housing that we need in the right locations? And how can we pick up some of the gaps that exist? Act 250 right now does not do, forests are kind of left out as a major consideration. Other resources are covered very adequately, but there's nothing in Act 250 to drive a good pattern of subdivision development in our forest. And so several times now the legislature has actually passed legislation to add new criteria to Act 250 to address forest fragmentation to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the impacts of fragmenting impacts to forest blocks and habitat connectors to really drive smart growth in our forests. And fortunately, the bill was once vetoed by the governor, and it's just held up in a larger negotiation, I would say right now, about what is the best way to reform Act 250. There's another bill this year, a comprehensive reform effort called S234 that's passed out of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. Will be on the floor soon for debate. Includes the criteria to add forest fragmentation criteria. It would enhance Act 250's review of fragmenting road and driveway development of a certain length that would have a sort of a long intrusion into an intact forest block. And there's also provisions in here to allow more flexibility for hours of forest processing wood products, which obviously maintaining a viable kind of forestry operations in the state does relate to trying to keep forests as forests. Sheldon, you're muted, but I'm guessing you're telling me that we're running up against where we want to cut this off, and I only have 2 more slides. H606 is some of you may have heard that President Biden has an executive order to try and accelerate land conservation to get to 30% land conservation by the year 2030. There's a bill that is actually about to be debated for 3rd reading on the House floor this afternoon. It passed yesterday by a very strong vote, the House, and essentially would come up with a goals for the state to achieve land conservation, 30% by 2030 and 50% of our land base in some kind of conserved status by 2050. And it would require the Agency of Natural Resources to develop a conservation plan to meet these goals. What would be the different techniques and strategies that are needed, the level of funding that's needed to work with willing landowners to conserve their land, what are the different management prescriptions that we would have as part of that on the land. And it uses conservation design as a guide to get to the targets and the goals within conservation design that Jens highlighted. So this would be a comprehensive land conservation planning effort. And then H697 is a bill that passed the House already with a very strong vote and is now in the Senate for consideration. And this would create a new subcategory in our current use program called reserve forest land. And it would allow qualifying parcels to create old forest conditions under a passive forest management approach, meaning you wouldn't have to harvest the land. It could be for old forest conditions over time. And the qualifying features that you need to have in order to enroll in this category, should this bill become law, are outlined here. So there's something called ecologically sensitive treatment areas in current use. These are sensitive areas where you don't have to harvest now. This bill is basically saying if you have 30% of these overall features on your parcel, you can enroll your entire parcel in this reserve forest land category. And there's actually quite a bit of qualifying acreage in Vermont that fits under this category. So we would have to see how popular it would be, but this is to help increase the conservation design goals of having more old forests represented in the state. Finally, it's just to let you know that we have a lot of resources in the state, both from the Fish and Wildlife Department and comprehensive publications they've put out, help us maintain a resilient landscape. And we also have our community strategies for Vermont's forest and wildlife, the VNRC publication that's about to be actually updated and published very soon, will be available for you. So with that, going to end the presentation and turn this over to Sheldon.
Thank you, Jamey. So now we're going to go into a Q&A section of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will try to get to as many of them as possible. But before we get to some audience questions, a question for both of you is if someone on the webinar today owns like a large parcel of land or knows someone who does, what are some recommendations you would give to them about how individual landowners can be part of the solution in terms of forest conservation?
So I'll start, and Jens, please weigh in. The publication that I just ended with, the Community Strategies for Vermont's Forests and Wildlife, has a lot of different strategies in there. It's really geared towards what municipalities can do, but we're about to update it for landowners. But if you're a landowner, I would suggest going to our webpage and taking a look at it. It describes a lot of the conservation and management opportunities that exist to manage and maintain a resilient forested landscape. Everything from knowing about the current use program as a way to enroll your forest land if you have 25 acres or more of forest land, and be able to significantly reduce the property tax burden on the property by maintaining it in an undeveloped state. There's a description of tools like conservation easements. So for example, if you're interested in permanent conservation, you can work with potentially a land trust to conserve your land, and then there's certain benefits to doing that, certain tax benefits, and obviously a whole lot of benefits to the state and our well-being by doing that. And the list goes on as far as different management, technical assistance opportunities, different programs based on state and federal agencies to help forest owners do watershed improvement, invasive species management control, to do wildlife habitat enhancement. And so Jens, since the department also offers assistance on that front, I'll turn it over to offer some.
Yeah, thanks. We have some excellent forest landowners, forest managers in Vermont. I would just add that the more you learn about where you live and your parcel and all of the ecological values that are present there, the better forest manager you will become, and the more you'll understand the need for some of those conservation tools that Jamey just outlined. So I guess my answer in simple is love your land and get to know it. And that will catapult you through all of the twists and turns of various technical assistance providers and programs that are available to you to take that love of the land to the next conservation level.
Thank you. So we have our first question in the chat from Ray, who asks about, can a number of smaller properties pool their land together under a current use plan enrollment? Lives in South Burlington, where there's valuable forest properties, but they tend to be small. I don't know if either of you could answer that question about the new land use legislation.
Sure. So unfortunately, the answer is no, although this has been a topic that's come up in discussions quite often. So it's not to say that the value of allowing this is not recognized. It's a question of how much land ultimately comes into the program, and while there is legislation right now that would potentially expand the ability of more forest land to come in, it would still have a minimum requirement of 25 acres. And so, while again, I want to acknowledge the value of landowners trying to work together to pool their resources, take advantage of programs like current use, the policy doesn't allow it now, probably partially because of the fiscal impact to the state of allowing small parcels in. It would be hard for the state to be able to absorb that decrease in revenue. But from an ecological perspective, it certainly is a valid question, and I understand your desire. So I would turn to other programs. Potentially, I don't know, some municipalities actually have their own version of current use, and you could look to see if South Burlington actually has that opportunity.
Thank you. The next question is, what would be a good route to take to help conserve state-owned land and keep it out of future timber harvest so that it might someday become old forest?
I'll jump in on that one. And Philip, I would really suggest getting involved in the long-range management planning process for various state-owned lands. And that's the best avenue, as I see you nodding. I'm sure you're aware, that's the real avenue for that sort of, that kind of public input. But I will say it's very much on the radar of state land managers. And we have a state lands ecologist who sits on all of the district stewardship teams and reviews the management plans as they come up for each of those state-owned parcels, not just the fish and wildlife owned land, but from other sectors of state government as well. And so maintaining that balance of different structure types, from old forest to young forest, is very important, and it's critically important ecological concern. And so it's very much on our radar screen. We can certainly debate the proportions of that, and I think that's an important debate to have. But I think the long range management planning process, it's not sexy, but that's where change happens.
And a kind of a follow-up question from that from Carolyn is there a good route to help conserve town forests? So there's more emphasis on old forests and town forests as well.
Yeah, so Carolyn, town forests, there's certainly funding mechanisms for town forests, and the Trust for Public Land and other groups have, as well as Forest Parks and Rec, have been very supportive of creating new town forests and trying to make that happen. See, somebody's on from Huntington, and the Huntington Town Forest is a great example of what can happen with persistent effort over many years. But I will say that town forests are very much in that same crucible of all of the different uses that we want to see out of our forest lands, just as the state lands are. And so as we think about the balance between recreation and wildlife, or timber harvest and wildlife, and all these different values that we expect from our forests, it can be very difficult to navigate what the balancing act should look like at the municipal level. So I hear you, more old growth forests within town-owned land would be great, but it takes a lot of work to come up with that balancing act within a town.
So we also have a couple questions about zoning. Could you speak to the ways that town zoning and places that towns that don't have zoning, and the ways that zoning impacts forest conservation?
Yeah, so based on our review, there are about 20% of towns in Vermont that don't have any zoning. I recently talked to somebody in Worcester, and there's a proposed project there, and they're concerned, but there's no zoning in the town. And so those towns are more vulnerable to impacts of potentially large scale development if there's no consideration of how to review those impacts. And so the best I can say is it's up to each town to decide. It's in their purview, and for whatever reason, certain number of towns in Vermont have decided not to have zoning, but it doesn't matter, because it means if there's no zoning or there's no subdivision regulations, it means there's very little ability to then shape how the development does occur, unless it triggers Act 250. And we know from our own research that a very small percentage, roughly like 1% to 2% of subdivisions in Vermont that are proposed are typically large enough to actually trigger Act 250. I did, just while we're on this topic and we're talking sort of about the interplay of development and projects and housing's come up, there was a question earlier, and I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss, I think Michael's, about the need to both inhibit development on forest land, but promote it in centers. There's a stick and a carrot approach. And I just wanted to acknowledge that that's very much what's being discussed right now in the legislature, like on these topics of Act 250. There's housing bills. There are housing components of the Act 250 reform. And I would just say from VNRC's perspective that we agree. We do need to come up with incentives right now in order to have appropriate compact development in our growth centers, our areas that have been designated and slated for more intensive development. We do have a housing crisis, an affordable housing crisis, and we do need to look for the carrot approach on creating more affordable housing in Vermont, while at the same time trying to maintain a rural and resilient landscape that works well for Vermont's well-being.
On the subject of zoning, I'd just like to add, there's some great examples of what can be done with zoning, and I'll give a shout out. I see a variety of folks on from South Burlington. in South Burlington just reworked its zoning, and it's coming under fire. But that was a really long and thoughtful process that South Burlington engaged in terms of thinking about what a climate resilient future could look like and how they could get there through regulation. And so I really want to acknowledge that process. Another good example is Bolton, who recently redid their zoning and actually were able to expand their forest district to think about the network of connected lands coming down to I-89. And they took a little bit of that rural residential, what had been rural residential district, and changed it into a forest district and lined it up with transportation infrastructure under the highway. And just a couple examples of what can be done with that sort of thoughtful planning process.
Okay, so we have a question from Kenny about recreation and when it comes to forest blocks. Is there a good understanding of the various types of recreation and their effects on intact forest blocks? Would it be better to have some forest blocks left alone from typical recreation? Are there any guidelines for various levels of conservation?
Kenny, this is a huge issue, and I think we're really just at the cusp of a discussion about what the balancing act looks like. There is some great research on the effects of recreation for wildlife, and the starting point for that is recreation has impacts. I know we think we don't, but every snowflake in an avalanche can't plead not guilty. So we need to start thinking about our effects and the effects of recreation. So there is an understanding that recreation does have impacts, and it can really be boiled down to where there's a lot of trails and where there are not trails. And those forests that don't have trails are a real limited resource. And so we need to start thinking about, as we're taking our balancing act of forest management to the next level, that understanding of where there are trails and where they're not trails, and ensuring that we're maintaining places that aren't trailed are really important. Let me just be clear. I recreate in the woods. I love it, and I think there is a benefit to having Vermonters out in the woods enjoying being out there. That is the why that drives conservation. But we also need to be aware of our impacts, and so there is a balancing act there. So good guidelines on the various levels of conservation? No, I don't think we're at that place yet of being able to really define that guidance. But if you think about the state land system, we designate different areas for different intensity of use, right? We have state parks where we assume there's a large amount of usage. We have wildlife management areas where we don't have huge use. We have dispersed recreation. We have wilderness areas where we anticipate even less use. And so that concept of having different zones with different intensity of use, I think, is the next step that we need to develop in terms of guidelines for recreation moving forward.
And I would just very quickly add that VNRC has been part of a comprehensive discussion at the statewide level, along with the recreation community, about this very question of what is the environmental review role? How do we set up good siting and planning for trails? And what is the program to do that? And while those conversations continue, it's just recognizing now that there is a need to try and promote sustainable recreation in the state. A lot of people are interested in that. How we do it with the best management practices and the guidelines is as Jens acknowledged, we're at the beginning of fleshing that out now.
Thank you. So we have another question. How much emphasis is being placed on access of Indigenous communities to these conserved forests for their culture and ceremonial needs? And I would also ask, how do we make sure that there is equitable access to these conservated forest lands?
So there is a bill. I don't know if it's going to move out of the House this year. Representative Chena had it. That was to improve access. And that was from the consideration of improving access to the BIPOC community for land ownership. And the last, I believe it wasn't quite out of committee yet, but it was under discussion. So the legislature are having some of these discussions. As far as access of indigenous communities to the conserved forest for their ceremonial needs, I think it's a really important question. And I think it would be important for us to hear from the indigenous community about, where they see the gaps in that and what would be are there policy solutions that are needed? Where are the current challenges right now? And I did notice there was a question right before that about the minimum lot size,
Yes.
in forest zones, so that all parcels could potentially be enrolled in UVA. A lot of forest related districts in Vermont do have a minimum acreage so that you could enroll in UVA. So that is sort of a tried and true way of going about it. Some people counter, well, then we're sort of fragmenting our lands just by having larger, parcels that are at that minimum 25 acre size. Some communities actually go larger and require even larger parcels, so it doesn't have that fragmentation. But yes, I think in general, it is important to be considerate of trying to allow parcels to be enrolled in current use. And so if you had a 23 acre minimum lot size, you've really just defeated, the whole ability of a landowner, to enroll in current use. So it is important. It's important to consider it. And we can help with those questions if you're working on that at the local municipal level.
Savina, I also encourage you to look at setting density. In Jericho, you could set density goals for how many acres or for how many houses per acre you're looking for in different zones, similar to what Waitsfield has done. And so you can get at a little bit more nuance than just the minimum lot size. Jamey, do you have any thoughts on that, setting density?
It's a really interesting. I think that would be a good. We're happy, like for any of you who have questions, like technical questions on some of this, and I'm just looking at the hour, please email us and we'd be glad to have a discussion with you about important topics like how to deal with appropriate density and some of the other topics that have come up. I think we don't have enough time right now to get into that.
So as we close, I will just add, answering one last question from the chat, that this presentation and the recording will be on the VNRC website soon. So you can check there to see the recording, as well as through the recording, see the presentation and the slide deck that was shared. Thank you so much for being here, for joining this conversation. We really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. I hope you have a good rest of your day.